Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a highly debated academic framework, the Hereditarian Model of Intelligence. Touching on genetics, environment, and human potential, our goal today isn't to take sides or validate anything, but to act strictly as academic translators. We're going straight to the source material to understand exactly how this model views cognitive differences between populations. To do this objectively, we'll break this down into 5 core pillars: the hereditarian hypothesis defined, quantitative genetics and heritability, regression toward the mean, Spearman and adoption studies, and finally, not strict biological determinism. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the hereditarian hypothesis defined. So what exactly is hereditarianism? At its core, it's the view that biological and genetic predispositions exert a substantially stronger influence on life outcomes, things like cognitive ability and educational attainment, than structured environmental factors do. When applied to group differences, the model posits that even if environments were perfectly equalized across the board, average group differences in cognitive testing would not entirely disappear. To really understand the historical baseline for this debate, we have to look at the numbers that originally sparked it. In the context of the United States, academic literature frequently cites a 15-point difference, which is exactly one standard deviation in average IQ scores between Black and white Americans. This specific numerical gap is what the hereditarian model attempts to explain through a biological lens. Now, researchers across the board actually agree on something huge here. There is massive statistical overlap. I mean, literally nobody disagrees that top-scoring Black individuals score just as high as top-scoring white individuals, and vice versa. But hereditarians focus heavily on the population averages, noting that historically, only about 15 to 20% of the white population scores below the average Black score. So the dispute in the academic field isn't whether these differences exist on paper, but rather where the responsibility for them actually lies. To explain this gap, hereditarians draw a hard line between themselves and what's called the culture-only position. You see, the culture-only model assumes that group differences in cognitive testing are 100% environmental in origin, driven entirely by factors like socioeconomic status, education, or cultural biases in the tests themselves. In stark contrast, the hereditarian view argues for a roughly 50-50 etiology. They posit that the gap is about 50% genetic and 50% environmental, arguing that a really significant chunk of that mean difference has a genetic root. Moving to Section 2, quantitative genetics and heritability. You might be wondering, how do you even attempt to measure something like this? Well, proponents rely heavily on quantitative biostatistics and behavioral genetics. They look at family studies, adoption studies, and most notably, the absolute gold standard, identical twins reared apart. By comparing identical twins who share 100% of their DNA but were raised in completely different environments, researchers try to isolate the genetic variance of cognitive traits from environmental noise. And here is the kicker. Based on those twin and adoption studies, hereditarian researchers estimate that the heritability of intelligence falls somewhere between 0.50 and 0.80 in adult populations. Basically, 50 to 80%, actually, let me be precise, they mean 50 to 80% of the variance in intelligence within a given population comes down to genetic differences. Proponents of the model use these high-within-group heritability estimates as a foundational stepping stone to argue for partial genetic causation between different groups. All right, Section 3, regression toward the mean. This brings us to what is probably the model's most specific and definitely most controversial, quantitative prediction, regression toward the mean. It's a statistical principle where extreme traits tend to move closer to the average in the next generation. Hereditarians apply this directly to racial IQ gaps. The theory predicts that children born to high IQ Black parents, say parents with an IQ of 115, will predictably have scores that regress downward toward the Black population mean of 85. Conversely, children of white parents with that exact same 115 IQ will regress toward the white population mean of 100. So why does this directional regression happen? Hereditarians argue it's due to Mendelian inheritance. As genetic traits shuffle and recombine across generations, children naturally pull back toward their ancestral population's average. In this framework, that group average acts sort of like a genetic anchor or ceiling, pulling subsequent generations toward it, completely regardless of the immediate family's socioeconomic wealth or environmental advantages. To back this up, proponents point to matched parent studies. When researchers looked at Black and white children whose parents both had identically high IQs of 120, the data showed a highly disparate regression. The Black children averaged closer to 100, pulling heavily toward that 85 mean, while the white siblings averaged closer to 110, pulling toward the 100 mean. Hereditarians argue that purely environmental, culture-only theories simply cannot quantitatively account for this disparity in similarly advantaged households. Section 4. Spearman and Adoption Studies. Beyond regression, the model leans on two other major pillars. First up is Spearman's hypothesis. This suggests that testing gaps aren't just uniform across all types of questions. Instead, the gaps are widest on tests heavily saturated with G, or general intelligence. Hereditarians argue this proves the tests aren't just culturally biased on specific trivia, but rather reflect differences in foundational cognitive processing. They also test their theories through cross-cultural adoption data. A really famous example is the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, which tracked Black children adopted into highly advantaged upper-middle-class white families. Because these children still scored lower on average than their white peers by age 17, the hereditarian model interprets this as evidence that heavily advantaged environments do not fully overwrite population-level cognitive gaps. And finally, Section 5, not strict biological determinism. We absolutely have to highlight a crucial nuance here to accurately represent the theory. It is a massive misconception to equate this model with absolute inescapable fate. As this quote from leading proponents, J. Philippe Rushton and Arthur Jensen, shows, the framework explicitly rejects hard, immutable biological determinism for individuals. Recognizing a genetic component is not at all the same as saying traits are permanently written in the genes in a way that makes intervention futile. The literature is super clear on this. Heritability is just a snapshot, a population statistic for a specific time. It absolutely does not dictate an unchangeable future limit. Profound environmental changes can still drastically shift outcomes. For instance, just a single nutritional fix, like preventing iodine deficiency, can raise cognitive outcomes by up to 13.5 IQ points. That's huge. Similarly, genetic conditions like PKU that cause cognitive impairment can be entirely bypassed with a specific diet. Environmental change is still highly effective here. By anchoring on that 50-50 etiology model, the hereditarian framework intentionally maintains that up to half of all cognitive variance is still dictated by environmental opportunity, nutrition, and social context. It's a model of partial genetic causation, meaning it leaves a massive piece of the pie entirely up to the environment. So, what does this all mean? Why does objectively breaking down the mechanics of a controversial framework like this even matter? Well, understanding the precise claims and boundaries of polarizing models is absolutely essential. By acting as academic translators and examining exactly what researchers mean by heritability or regression to the mean, we equip ourselves to engage with the actual data. How might this structural clarity change the way we evaluate sweeping academic debates? Because when we strip away the noise and look directly at the claims, we foster a much deeper, much more productive understanding of the scientific discourse regarding human potential. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.